It has been said that the whole purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows. The goal of the Rohini Gadgek Foundation is to inspire the young so that they push themselves into dreaming new dreams and reaching new frontiers. That is why late last year, the foundation tied up with the Ambedkar University, one of India's foremost educational institutions, and Pradhan, a non-profit organization working in the development sector, to institute 3 Rohini Gadgek fellowships for their MPhil in development practice. This is a rural immersion-based program that will help create a new genre of developmental professionals to work among the rural and urban poor to facilitate a long-standing transformation in their lives.
I'm deeply grateful for the invitation to speak here today. I must admit that I myself was extremely diffident about the prospect of speaking here. We are living in a time of serial scams, serial gang rapes, a totally dysfunctional polity, and in this milieu, it is very difficult to find something to say that is both sincere and hopeful. And then, in the encounter with Rohini, and here I must acknowledge the help of my friend Satya Sivaraman, who knew her in Chiang Mai. One finds this young woman full of commitment, optimism, and hope. So as an old man, I am grateful for this opportunity. Rohini was interested in the problem of hunger, and we will certainly talk about endemic hunger. But before that, I would like to set the context. When we go back to the roots of public health in the 19th century, we encounter the German pathologist Rudolf Virchow, one of the founders of modern scientific medicine, who said, politics is medicine writ large. In present times, the World Health Organization had constituted a commission on the social determinants of health under the chairship of Sir Michael Marmot, which summed up its executive summary with a single slogan, quote, "Inequity is killing people on a grand scale," unquote. I remember listening to Sir Michael at a meeting in Kolkata organized by Professor Amartya Sen's Prutiji Trust. And Sir Michael talked about a slum in present-day Glasgow, where the people in the slum had a life expectancy of 54 years, while the average life expectancy in India at that time was 61 years. This example, given by Sir Marmot at the beginning of the 21st century, reminds us of Friedrich Engels' masterly analysis of 19th century England in The Condition of the Working Class in England, his book, in which Engels pointed out the differential life expectancy of different sections of the working people in England. So public health is preeminently the terrain of equity and justice. But it goes even further, and public health is today the terrain of sharply contending systems of political economy. This was brought home to us very clearly in the course of the deliberations of the Steering Committee for Health in the 12th five-year plan, when a very well-known cardiothoracic surgeon and medical entrepreneur and fellow member of the steering committee delivered a comprehensive plan for the privatization of primary health care, at the end of which he said, and I quote, "In the 20th century, industry was the motor of the economy. In the 21st century, health care will play that role." The Planning Commission, in finalizing its plans for health in the 12th five-year plan, has put aside very unceremoniously the recommendation of its own high-level expert group for the universalization of healthcare. This is well of a piece with the history of noble declarations followed by deliberate non-performance that started with the Bohr Committee report. In 1946, the Bohr Committee boldly declared a detailed plan for a healthcare system in which, quote, "no one would be denied appropriate care because of the inability to pay." In 1978, we had the International Conference on Primary Health Care in Alma-Ata, then in the Soviet Union, which promised health for all by 2000 AD. Sounds laughable now. The brave plans announced at Alma-Ata were set aside by the early 80s, and enormous public resources were made increasingly available to a privatized healthcare system. With the onset of the globalization privatization regime in 1991, corporate healthcare really came into its own. Not only were the injunctions for equity in the directive principles of state policy specifically repudiated, but indeed they were turned around on their heads, and it was held to be a legitimate strategy of economic development to foster inequality in the economy, the quote, trickle-down unquote theory. Ambedkar, in delivering the constitution to a nascent republic, had specifically drawn attention to the contradiction between political democracy and social and economic polarization. The practice of polarization has resulted in the institutionalization of inequity. I will try to trace that institutionalization in some fields of public health, which is my area of work. And then we will take a more general issues in hand. These processes duly had their effect on the public health and healthcare systems. The trickle-down theory had its effect on the public health and healthcare systems. In 2004, the Chhattisgarh State Health Resource Center carried out a census count of all the public sector facilities. We took as our index capability the ability to routinely perform a cesarean section. Any hospital, we counted the hospitals which could routinely perform a cesarean section, not as, you occasionally get some minister goes and something is unveiled and one cesarean section is done and then you go back to the same old system. No. Routinely performing cesarean sections, we held that as the criterion. And in this state, for this population of 24 million people in Chhattisgarh in 2004, there were 3 centers located at the Raipur and Bilaspur medical colleges and 1 district center at Durg, which routinely performed cesarean sections. Of course, there were plenty of private facilities, but these were inaccessible to those unable to pay. About a year ago, the West Bengal media recorded the case of a woman who went in labor from one hospital to another and finally died after giving birth to twins on the pavement in front of a government hospital. Jurists would be especially interested to know that the West Bengal Corpus Juris includes laws that specifically proscribe any hospital from turning away a woman in labor. The Chhattisgarh government has recently announced a policy of privatization of all diagnostic facilities attached to its government hospitals. This will place rational quality care even further out of reach of the poor. And earlier this year, we held a public meeting on health policy in Hyderabad. And Dr. Kameshwari told us the shocking details of how the Arogyashri program had been misused for unjustified hysterectomies. No indication has completed her reproductive career. So 22-year-old women are subjected to hysterectomy. Unjustified hysterectomies to the point where up to 20% of the women in some areas had their uteruses removed when the norm is less than 1%. In Tamil Nadu today, 3,000 doctors are continuing in temporary employment because they cannot be paid the regular salary. The government refuses to regularize their services. These are the states which are reputed to have a much higher standard of health, public health and health care than other states of the Indian Union. I would now like to take up a few of the predominant social determinants of health in greater detail. We will start our discussion with the phenomenon of chronic undernutrition, which can also and more simply be called endemic hunger, and which I will try to show is equivalent to a state of chronic severe famine. It is our view that there exists today over large parts of the Indian population a state of chronic stable famine which may tip over into the kind of famine we are more familiar with at any point of time. Before we embark on our examination of, I have written this paper called The Coming Famine in India. The Coming Famine in India. Before we embark on our examination of the coming famine in India, we would do well to look at some recent history, specifically at the Bengal famine of 1943. 3 million people died in that famine. I heard stories about that famine from my mother, as did many middle-class Bengalis of my age. There was no shortage of grain. This is one point I would like to emphasize, because everybody equates famine with a shortage of food, particularly a shortage of grain. There was no shortage of grain in Bengal in 1943, just as there is no shortage of grain in India today. Indeed, there is so much excess grain, the government is hard put to store it so it does not rot. Amartya Sen has famously analyzed the economics of that famine as, quote, the failure of exchange entitlements, unquote. In other words, those social arrangements that enabled the people to access the food that they needed broke down. Recently, a young historian, Madhushri Mukherjee, has further extended this analysis. She has shown, on the basis of documentary evidence, in a book called Churchill's Secret War, that a racist Winston Churchill made a special direct intervention to ensure that the rice from Bengal was sequestered to feed the British war effort. And then he similarly sequestered the Australian wheat that was supposed to take its place. Finally, in order to forestall a Japanese crossing of the Bay of Bengal from Myanmar, which had been occupied by the Japanese by that time, so that they couldn't cross over the Bay of Bengal to Medinipur, destroyed all the grain in Medinipur. He declared a scorched earth policy in Medinipur, destroyed all the grain, and in order to prevent any riverine transport of grain, burnt all the boats and sank them in the river. All this in 1943 on the orders of Mr. Churchill. The needs of the army were deliberately privileged over the lives of 3 million of the Bengal peasantry. The point I am trying to make here is that famines, and by extension, the other human rights abuses that go on and on happening in our country and around the world, do not just happen on their own account. They are perpetrated as the result of policies that privilege the rich and powerful and by implication harm the poor and disenfranchised. While by and large this has always been the general order of affairs, for the last 20 years in India we have been functioning as part of in a regime that specifically repudiates the constitutional injunctions for economic justice and equity embodied in the directive principles of state policy in our constitution, and valorizes the argument that having the rich get richer and poor get poorer is good for the economy and the way to go forward. An extremely apposite example is provided by Mr. Sharad Pawar, who at a cabinet meeting on the 14th of December 1911 to consider the food security bill, which is currently before Parliament, is reported to have said, "How can we feed every mouth in the country? If there is a famine, we will not be able to feed everybody." There is one more general point about the definition of famine that I wish to make before coming to specifics. Amrita Rangaswamy's EPW October 1985 critique of Sen's exchange entitlements approach needs to be taken into account. She says, quote, "The sudden collapse into starvation that has been identified with the famine condition is only the final phase of famine, when the stigmata of starvation become visible and the victims have collapsed. Famine is not, however, an event marked by the death of the victim. The basic failure in the understanding of famine is the inability to recognize the political, social, and economic determinants that mark the onset of the process. We need, therefore, to redefine famine and identify the various factors, political, social, psychological, and economic, that operate to keep large classes in the population under continuous pressure. Many of us have a kind of apocalyptic view of famine, and there is no doubt that once the stigmata of starvation that Amrita Rangaswamy talks about are revealed, the images haunt you lifelong, as in Jainal Abidin's paintings of the Bengal famine, or the photographs that came out of Biafra. But these images are constructed out of an everyday reality that would require special insight to perceive as signifying famine. Reliable and adequately representative anthropometric surveys are difficult to perform and hence difficult to come by. Recently, the Nandi Foundation had performed an assessment of children's nutritional status, which found around 44% of all under 5 children victims of malnutrition. Prime Minister Mr. Manmohan Singh said while releasing the study report that it was a, quote, national shame, unquote. Of that there is no doubt, but the shame is familiar because similar data have been available from the National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau, part of the National Institute of Nutrition, NIN, in Hyderabad, for many years, and they are also corroborated by the findings of the NFHS 3 carried out in 2005-2006. Incidentally, after NFHS 3, there has not been any wide-ranging study of comparable scale of malnutrition in India. Now, outsiders are coming in to do a demographic and health survey, which will be ready by 2014. We have the largest population of hungry people in the world, but we do not have adequate surveys to enumerate what is happening, to identify what is happening to people under the regime under this nutritional regime. Meanwhile, the NFHS 3 tells us that around half of all deaths in the under 5 age group were closely associated with their poor nutritional status. The CIA World Fact Book puts India's infant mortality rate at 46, 14th highest in the world, higher than that of every South Asian country except Bangladesh, which is 49. To put the matter in a world context, every 3 seconds, somewhere around the world, a child dies of causes related to avoidable malnutrition. In those 3 seconds, the world armaments industry spends $120,000 in order to keep that system reliably in place. But so far we have been talking only about childhood malnutrition. Often when the talk turns to malnutrition, people assume that it is childhood malnutrition one is talking about. One reason is that sensitive and robust anthropometric measures for adult nutritional status have been in common use for less than 20 years. The body mass index, which is now in common use, is fairly well standardized, both at the individual and community level. It is not applicable to children but only to adults who have finished growing, because it relates the weight to the height of the person. The critical value of BMI, the BMI is given by dividing the weight in kilograms by the square of the height in meters. The critical value of the BMI is 18.5. The BMI is given by dividing the weight in kilograms by the square of the height in meters. The critical value of the BMI is 18.5. Values below 18.5 are indicative of chronic energy deficit, that is hunger. Pednekar from Mumbai has demonstrated through epidemiological studies that death rates increase as BMI descends below 18.5. If the death rate above 18.5 is taken as unity, then roughly death rates from 18.5 to 17 are about 1 1/3. Those from 17 to 16 are about 1 1/2. And BMI values below 16 are associated with a death rate that is double the normal death rate above 18.5. WHO recommendations are that any community that has more than 40% of its members with a BMI below 18.5 should be regarded as a community in famine. What are the data regarding adult malnutrition in India today? The National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau is part of the NIN with headquarters in Hyderabad. The NNMB's latest survey results for Integrated Tribal Development Agency areas, that is, areas which are predominantly tribal population, published in 2009, show that 40% of men and 49% of women have a BMI below 18.5. That means these areas are all fit to be declared as famine areas, according by the WHO criteria, and can be considered as suffering from chronic hunger. By implication, these areas should be considered famine affected. For the rural areas across the country and by approximation for the country as a whole, the figures are 33% for men and 36% for women, the pooled figure being 35%. The same survey shows that 41.9% of subjects from the scheduled tribes have BMI values below 18.5, and among scheduled castes, 38.4% have values below 18.5. I myself have performed censuses in villages in Bastar before going to Bastar became difficult for me. and I have found 70% of the population this is a census. That means everybody it's not a survey. Everybody in the village is measured for BMI. 70% of the population has a BMI below 18.5 in number of villages that I have surveyed. The Satya Committee on Minorities shows that large proportions of the minority population have BMI values below 18.5. In other words, large sections of the population of India are suffering from chronic energy deficit and either qualify for or come perilously close to a state of famine. This famine is not circumscribed in time. So we have a chronic, stable famine that exists over large sections of the Indian population. The NNMB surveys also show significant anemia in 55% of the men and 70% of the women, and a diet deficient in comparison with the recommended dietary allowances in every nutrient that was measured, including vitamin A, vitamin D, B vitamins, vitamin C, and proteins. Nor is this all. Utsa Patnaik, a senior economist from JNU, has demonstrated declining cereal consumption over a 10-year period from 1994 to 2004. So not only do we have chronic energy deficit, but the deficit is increasing. These findings are borne out by the findings of the National Sample Survey 2009-2010. Even more chilling are the implications of the data regarding the epidemiology of tuberculosis, the paradigmatic hunger-associated opportunist infection. My colleagues working in the Jan Swasthya Sahyog in Bilaspur have established a series of about 1,000 culture-confirmed cases of tuberculosis, in which there is almost a universal association between pulmonary tuberculosis and BMI below 18.5. Dr. Rajiv Dasgupta of JNU has shown in the Indian Journal of Community Medicine that over a period of 10 years, the deaths from pulmonary tuberculosis have gone up 5-fold. So this is the picture at this stage of famine before the stigmata become visible. It must be noted that this state of affairs can and does coexist with an abundance of stored food in the godowns of power. Ekhane Shondha name, there's a poem in Bengali which I'll translate for you. Ekhane Shondha name, Bistirno elaka jure, dusk descends here over a vast hinterland, Bagher thabar maton, like a tiger's paw. Mullah, this is written by a Muslim poet, a friend of mine. Mullah Ghazi Ansar, his name is. Mullaদের উঠোনে ধান কানায় কানায় ঠাসা. Grain is stuffed in the courtyards of the mullahs. দুর্ভিক্ষ শুধু আমাদের পাড়ায়. Famine exists only in our neighborhood. So this is the picture at the stage of famine before the stigmata become visible. It must be noted that this state of affairs can and does coexist with an abundance of stored food in the godowns of power. The people who are the victims are able to survive only because of their access to common property resources: water, land, forest, knowledge of and access to biodiversity. Ethnographic studies have estimated that up to 90% of people who live off their access to common property resources, 90% of the livelihood comes from their access to common property resources. But under the aegis of the doctrine of eminent domain, of which I will come later, more later, doctrine of eminent domain, the Indian state stands guarantor to a process of expropriation in which all these resources are garnered into the hands of Indian and multinational finance capital. To this end, the state is prepared to deploy all its power, unarmed when possible, but armed when necessary. As Supreme Court said in Nandini Sundar's case, which was about the Salwa Judum, tax breaks for the rich and guns for the poor. This is our vision for the future. One mitigating factor in this complex picture has been the PUCL versus Union of India right to food case. Whatever achievements we have in the PDS today all over India are an outcome of the interlocutory judgments given by the judges in the Supreme Court during the course of this case, which has been running now for the last 10 years. Which has been going on for the last 10 years in the Supreme Court in a non-adversarial format. The entire present shape of the PDS in the country is an outcome of the interlocutory orders issued by this court in the case summarized below. PDS highlights: 1. Provision of 35 kilos of grain for every BPL family per month. 2. Midday meals for school children. Supplementary feeding for under 5 children. Supplementary food for pregnant and lactating women. While the outcome in terms of PDS of the right to food case definitely provides some relief, the fact of widespread hunger and its varied manifestations, which we have noted already, shows that this relief is inadequate and uneven. Some of the most, quote, prosperous, unquote, areas of the country record high degrees of malnutrition and hunger, including Maharashtra, large sections of Maharashtra, large sections of Gujarat, all highly developed states, areas, high degree of malnutrition in these areas. Gujarat and Maharashtra, for example. Moreover, we have already noted Mr. Sharad Pawar's caveats about the food security bill. Once this bill becomes an act, instead of taking us further towards food security, it will take us several steps backward. The process of categorization, which has bedeviled the existing PDS, will be much more complex and liable to misuse in the act. The amount of grain available may be significantly smaller. Moreover, the entire process of grain distribution may in the end be replaced by cash transfer systems. In fact, all these nutritional disabilities, the so-called stigmata of starvation, as I have already pointed out, have been taking place in a regime in which there is an abundance of grain, what is known as the Green Revolution. This so-called revolution is the result of the concentrated, subsidized application of exogenous energy in the form of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, water, and logistical inputs in the form of mechanical tillage, transport and storage to grow almost exclusively rice and wheat. This entire effort has resulted in the devastation of our indigenous traditions of low-input sustainable agriculture, our millet economy, our rainwater harvesting techniques, devastated our soils, and not only exhausted our groundwater, but contaminated what water there is in the ground with widespread contaminants like arsenic and fluoride. Huge tracts of agricultural and forest land have been diverted to industrial and commercial use to grow commercial crops like tobacco, ethanol, soybean for European and American cattle, and sugarcane to produce more diabetes in India and abroad. Or, for example, to build 52 huge hydroelectric dams in the seismically unstable Brahmaputra Valley, and as we are seeing with the Omkareshwar and Indira Sagar dam mountains, with no proper system of rehabilitation in place. In the era of peak oil, with world oil prices spiraling upwards, very soon this kind of subsidized concentrated application of exogenous energy is no longer going to be feasible, let alone profitable. If by that time we have not managed to save our soils, our water economy, our seed systems, our entire culture of growing, storing and equitably distributing food in sufficient quantity and variety to keep us healthy, that is the famine that is inevitable and superimposed on the existing situation, the stigmata will be horrendous indeed. So what is to be done? In the short term, we need to modify our food security bill, despite Sharad Pawar's apprehensions, so that everyone can get enough food. Not just cereals, not just wheat and rice, but food, including millets and pulses and oil, to keep them well and free of the stigmata of starvation. In the longer term, we need to build a popular campaign against useful and harmful agriculture, like growing sugarcane, tobacco, alcohol, or soybean. We need to revive our indigenous traditions of growing food, including millets, pulses, green leafy vegetables, and animal protein to supplement the diet. We need to preserve privileged community-based food storage and distribution, and we need to build a society that privileges equity in food, of course, but also in living together peacefully. I'd just like to take up one or two more. We have dealt with food. I'd just like to deal with water and open defecation and one or two other issues before I go on to a theoretical generalization of our findings today. I'm sorry, I can't see your faces. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
About water, I am quoting from a beautiful article written by Mr. Shekhar Kapoor, the film director, in a recent issue of Tehelka magazine. It's written very beautifully. I didn't see any point in trying to churn out my own stuff, so I'm just quoting what he has written. Whose water is it anyway? In Mumbai, just across the road from the Juhu Ville Parle scheme, all the beautiful people and film stars live opposite a slum called Nehru Nagar. Once a day, or maybe even less, water arrives in tankers run by the local water mafia and their goons. Women and children wait in line for a bucket of water, and fights break out as the tankers begin to run dry. Yet literally across the road, the stars, after their workouts in the gym or a day on a film set, can stay in the shower for hours. The water will not stop flowing, often at less than half the cost that the slum dwellers pay for a single bucket of water. Whose water is it anyway? "85% of the people in India and many similar numbers in other parts of the world live under acute water-stressed conditions. We constantly talk about the education of the girl child without addressing the fact that in many rural belts across India, the girl child spends most of every day walking to a water source miles away just to fetch water. Actual water cost to it, which is subsidized by society in general. A special problem with water is fecal oral contamination of water. Just this last week, we have had the results of a survey performed in Cochin. Cochin is one of our most advanced urban centers. This survey in Cochin shows 15 wells, 15 tap water samples, and 30 samples from, I don't know if you have them here, but in the south you have these packaged drinking water in large plastic jars which are sold and refilled. So so 15 wells, drinking water wells, 15 tap water samples, and 30 of these jars, the water from these jars. And every single specimen of water in the city of Cochin that they tested had E. coli levels that are derived from feces. E. coli levels that were several hundred times the permissible limits for drinking water. This is a special problem, aspect of the problem with drinking water that we have today. I'll just come to the section on open defecation. There is a researcher who is working now in Sitapur, a person called Dean Spears, who has been working on the problem of defecation, and he has come out with the data that the Indian children are some of the shortest in the world. One of the reasons being that there is almost such widespread contamination with fecal oral contamination as a result of open defecation. More than half of all the people in the world who defecate in the open live in this country. And 55% of all households do not have access to any kind of toilet facilities for defecation. And as a result of that, we have huge amounts of fecal oral contamination that are reflected in the surveys performed in Cochin that were reported in the newspapers 1 week ago. Now I'd like to just come to a more general consideration, and that is as I have already said earlier in this talk, people are able to survive under these conditions because of their access to common property resources. And when their access to common property resources is compromised, their survival is called into question. Now, this whole issue of common property resources is something to which I want to draw your attention. When the whole question of the village community became a highly contentious issue at the time of the writing of the Indian Constitution in 1947, 1948. And in the course of that discussion, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, when the issue of the village community had come up, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had said, "I am therefore surprised that those who condemn provincialism and communalism," Dr. Ambedkar was against the concept of the village community Swaraj. "I am therefore surprised that those who condemn provincialism and communalism should come forward as champions of the village. What is the village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness and communalism? I am glad that the draft constitution has discarded the village and adopted the individual as its unit." Dr. Ambedkar had good reason to be chary of adopting the village community as the unit of the polity, because the oppression of those who were his special constituency, the oppression of those classes and of those castes was rampant at that time, as it continues to be today, within the framework of the village community. We have the Khap panchayats, we have Harijan, we have Dalit murders, we have all kinds of oppression taking place within the confines of the self-sufficient, of the village community that we are talking about. But at the same time, we have Gandhi's view, which is an alternative view. Gandhi writes in Harijan of 21st December 1947, "I must confess that I have not been able to follow the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly. The correspondent says that there is no mention or direction about village panchayats and decentralization in the foreshadowed Constitution. It is certainly an omission, calling for immediate attention if our independence is to reflect the people's voice. The greater the power of the panchayats, the better for the people." Just last week on the 18th of April, we have a very important Supreme Court decision in the matter of the Vedanta matter, The Supreme Court on Thursday ruled the Vedanta Group's bauxite mining project in the Niyamgiri hills of Orissa will have to get clearance from the Gram Sabha, which will consider the cultural and religious rights of the tribals and forest dwellers living in Raigada and Kalahandi districts. The Gram Sabha will examine the proposals, juxtaposing them with the community, individuals, as well as cultural and religious claims by the tribals and forest dwellers, including their rights of worship over the Niyamgiri hills, said the court. Gram Sabha can also examine whether the proposed mining area in Niyamadangar, 10 kilometers from the peak, would in any way affect the abode of the deity Niyam Raja. I don't want to go on further. So we have a kind of three entities here which are interacting one with the other. One is the sovereign state and eminent domain. One is the sovereignty of the individual and how this reacts with the sovereign state. And third is the sovereignty of the Gram Sabha. The Indian Constitution did not have any special provisions except for Article 40 with regard to the formation of panchayats. With the 73rd and 74th Amendment in 1992 came the establishment of Panchayati Raj. But Panchayati Raj had no special functions, no demarcated functions, no demarcated resource base. There was a term called devolution. Devolution was supposed to mean the voluntary giving up of power by the state governments to the Panchayati Raj institutions. Devolution has not worked. Voluntary giving up of power has never worked in any field, and certainly it has not worked in devolution. But under the PISA Act, extension of Panchayati Raj to Scheduled Areas Act, we have in 1996, we have the formation of the Gram Sabha as a sovereign and independent unit. Dr. B.D. Sharma, with whom I have had the privilege of having numerous discussions and who can be regarded as the father of the PISA Act, Dr. B.D. Sharma used to say that an ordinary person, ordinary peasant, man or woman, sitting in a Gram Sabha is a more important person than the President of India. So we have these contending forces. How do these contending forces, how are they going to play out? To have a community with which exercises community property rights, with the discipline of institutionalization of community property rights, which was led by the great economist Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize and who died last year. How are these community property rights to be articulated in the face of eminent domain? And what is going to be the status of the sovereign individual in this scenario? I think these are some of the important questions that we will have to answer for the future, because it is only when these issues are resolved that we will be able to tackle some of these very frightening issues regarding public health, very frightening issues regarding famine, very frightening issues regarding the availability of water. In Maharashtra today we have a widespread drought. What is going to happen to these issues? These are going to be determined through these processes. Thank you for listening to me.